Between 1862 and 1890, 5 men acquired more land than exists in France, and the federal government handed it to them for free. The trick was written into law. Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act starting in 1862, and here's where the money actually came from. The government didn't just give railroad companies track rights. They granted alternating sections of land 1 mile on each side of the railroad line. A railroad that stretched 100 miles west received roughly 12,800 acres. A transcontinental line, millions of acres. And that land, once the rails were laid, became instantly valuable. Exhibit 1, Leland Stanford's Central Pacific Railroad. Stanford and his partners, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, incorporated in 1861. By 1869, they'd driven the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, connecting east to west. The company received roughly 9 million acres from the federal government, not purchased, granted. The land alone was worth tens of millions of dollars. But here's the trick, and this is where forensic accounting gets interesting. The railroad companies didn't just sit on the land, they sold it, systematically, to settlers, to speculators, to land companies. The Central Pacific sold parcels at $2.50 to $10 per acre depending on location and proximity to the rail line. Land near stations commanded premiums, remote sections sold cheap, and the cash flowed directly into the railroad's balance sheet. Exhibit 2, J. Good's Union Pacific. Gould took control in 1873, and the land grants under the original Pacific Railway Act totaled 12 million acres. Good's strategy was different. He didn't just sell. He leveraged the land to secure loans. Banks would lend against the value of railroad land holdings. The railroad borrowed against future land sales to fund construction. Then it sold the land to repay the loans. It was a perpetual motion machine of collateral. The Northern Pacific James J. Hill's empire received 39 million acres. 39 million, that's larger than New York State. Hill didn't just sell the land, he developed it. He recruited settlers. He offered cheap parcels to farmers. He sold timber rights. He leased grazing land. Every revenue stream connected to that one federal land grant. Now let's trace the actual money. A settler buys 160 acres from the railroad at $5 per acre. That's $800. The railroad pockets it immediately, but the railroad didn't buy that land, it received it from the government. The cost basis was zero. The gross margin was 100%. Exhibit 3, the profit structure was essentially free. But there's a secondary layer. The railroads didn't just make money selling land once. They made money from the people who settled that land. Once settlers arrived, they needed to ship goods. Wheat, cattle, minerals, timber, all moved on the railroad. The railroad set freight rates. And here's the trick, the barons owned both the land and the transportation. They profited on the sale of the land and then on every shipment of goods produced on that land. Exhibit 4, Collis Huntington. Court documents from the 1880s show that Huntington's railroad subsidiaries purchased land from the Central Pacific at below market rates, then flipped it to settlers at market rates. The railroad sold to itself at a discount, then marked it up. It was vertical integration designed to capture every layer of profit. The scale defies intuition. Between 1862 and 1890, railroad companies received approximately 180 million acres of public land. That's 2% of all land in the continental United States, handed over for building rail lines that the barons controlled and profited from. The government subsidized the infrastructure, and the railroads captured the upside. Here's where it gets darker. Some of these land grants overlapped with Native American territories. The railroads, backed by federal authority, displaced indigenous populations to access the land. The legal framework gave the railroads a claim that superseded existing inhabitants. The federal government enforced it. The barons profited. Exhibit 5, the Northern Pacific's dealings in Montana and the Dakotas. The railroad received land in regions where Sioux, Crow, and Northern Cheyenne nations held claims. The railroad surveyed, divided, and sold the land. Federal troops enforced the transitions. The railroad's balance sheet recorded the revenue. The indigenous populations lost territory. By the 1890s, the major barons had amassed personal fortunes in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent to billions today. The source? Land they never purchased. Labor they extracted from settlers and workers. Freight rates they controlled because they owned the monopoly. And a legal framework that gave them claim to a continent. The strategy reshaped America's geography permanently. Cities grew where railroads decided to run lines. Farming regions emerged in areas the railroads developed. Populations migrated along routes the railroads controlled. The barons didn't just build transportation infrastructure, they architected where Americans could live and work. And here's the final accounting detail. Most of these barons paid minimal federal income tax. The income tax wasn't established until 1913. Between 1862 and 1913, they accumulated wealth almost entirely untaxed. The land grants were a subsidy with no strings. The profits were private. The risk was socialized onto settlers and workers. By the early 1900s, reform movements emerged. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 attempted to regulate railroad rates. But the land had already been distributed, the fortunes had already been made, the geography had already been rewritten. The regulatory framework came too late to recover what had been transferred. So let's restate what happened. 5 men and their partners received 180 million acres of public land at zero cost. They sold it, leveraged it, and extracted monopoly profits from the infrastructure they built on it. They displaced indigenous populations in the process. They accumulated fortunes in the hundreds of millions untaxed. And they permanently altered where Americans could live, work, and build. This wasn't market capitalism. It was state-sponsored wealth transfer dressed up as infrastructure development. The government supplied the raw material, the land. The railroads supplied the execution and captured all the upside. The model worked because the federal government had something to give away: a continent. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe to see how the next generation of business titans built their empires and which ones actually earned them. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.